as I previously mentioned, one of the seven kingdoms is Winterfell, and in Winterfell, they pray to the old gods, not the new ones, aka the seven. And in order for their prayers to be heard by these old gods, they stand before a weirwood tree, more specifically a heart tree, and that's the ones with the faces. We'll be introduced to that momentarily, but they believe it as a manifestation of the old gods, which is why the trees have those faces to begin with, right? And they pray to those ones specifically because there's other weirwood trees, but specifically the ones with faces are called heart trees by Ned and I'm sure other northerners specifically, right? And they are very creepy looking, which is worth noting. They are very, very creepy looking and worth mentioning. So this is also where Catelyn mentally in her own head begins to compare and contrast the two different faiths. We have the old gods, and then we have them versus the new, aka the seven. Right? Not gonna name all seven of them again. I did that previously, but I'll just refer to them as the seven. She describes the Godswood as this is the one in Winterfell. Just to remind you, they have a Godswood where they kind of go and pray, but I'm sure Ned is here by himself. But Catelyn describes it as a dark primal place, 3 acres of old forest untouched for thousands of years, some as old as the realm itself. This was a place of deep silence and brooding shadows. And the gods who lived here had no names. All right, so just to break that down in that area that they're in, that's crazy. 3 acres, that's enormous, you know? So that's just where they go. And they're back. I want to say almost kind of like a backyard for them, in a manner of speaking, because it's the Godswood is close or nearby the Winterfell main castle. So, it said that the Godswood existed even before Winterfell was there, right? It constructed Winterfell. It began construction over 8,000 years ago by Brandon the Builder, and he is a Stark legend. He's mentioned constantly throughout the book. He's kind of like not necessarily a myth because he did live, and they kind of like have he's like in the history books, which is like made by the Maesters, right? The different Maesters of the Seven Kingdoms. But when he existed, he was like just doing a bunch of shit for the different Seven Kingdoms, like constructing different buildings and keeps and castles and walls, and he's done a bunch, not just for Winterfell but for Westeros, right? We'll get more into that later, but as we continue the chapter, Catelyn begins to describe how she feels being in this area where her husband prays and kind of like just kind of takes kind of just chills and cools off. And she says when she's there in the Godswood, she feels very uneasy. And despite that feeling, she continues to carry on in here due to the fact that she knows she can always find Eddard Stark here, aka Ned. Um, and I quote from the book, but she knew she would find her husband here tonight whenever he took a man's life. Afterwards, he would seek the quiet of the Godswood. So we know just from that statement there that it's the same day as the execution of Garrett. And once again, to remind you, Garrett was executed for desertion. He deserted the Night's Watch, which is north of Winterfell. Um, and that's how the book started, as I previously said in the first chapter. And this is chapter 2. So yeah, be sure to watch the previous chapter for full context in case you haven't already. But we also learn in Catelyn's POV that, and I quote, she was of the faith, like her father and grandfather, and his father before him. Her gods had names, and their faces were as familiar as the faces of her parents. Worship was a septon. The Tullys kept the Godswood, as all the great houses did, but it was only a place to walk or read or lie in the sun. Worship was for the sept. So once again, this is just Catelyn comparing the two religions, the one that she grew up with, believing in the new gods, and the Northerners' religion, which is the old one. And as I mentioned before, they're used to um, priests, septons, a church, these holy buildings, while the Starks and Northerners they go to these trees, you know. And this is also how Catelyn feels kind of like a fish out of water, pun intended. But the book continues. For her sake, Ned had built a small sept where she might sing to the seven faces of God. But the blood of the first men still flowed in the veins of the Starks, and his own gods were the old ones, the nameless, faceless gods of the greenwood. They shared with the vanished children of the forest. Just want to make a mention or a note that this is the first time that the children of the forest, who have existed before Westeros was even called Westeros, um, this is the first time that they were mentioned, and this is they existed back when it was just land. It is cool just to think how far back the history goes for this made up world, and you have to admire the creativity of Georgerrmartin, as this is just the beginning of the story. Um, but with the children of the forest, they existed before anyone came, right? On the land known currently as Westeros and the Seven Kingdoms. They existed everywhere and they had their own names for the Seven Kingdoms, right? For Winterfell and the Wall and what's it called? Uh King's Landing and Dorne, right? All these different places. They had their own names for them amongst themselves, that being the children of the forest. And then eventually the people who came over and landed were, I want to say, it's the first men and the Andals and the Royner. That's the different kind of their races of people and humans in the Seven Kingdom. But the story then mentions a heart tree. The heart tree, Ned called it. The werewood's bark was white as bone, and its leaves dark red, like 1,000 blood-stained hands. A face had been carved into the trunk of the great tree, its features long and melancholy, the deep-cut eyes red with dried sap, and strangely watchful. They were old, those eyes, older than Winterfell itself. They had seen Brandon the Builder set the first stone, if the tales were true. It was said that the children of the forest had carved the faces in the trees. So a little eerie. A little eerie. So we get even more history and lore behind the heart trees of the north, including how the children of the forest are involved with the old gods since they carved the faces onto the weirwood trees, making them heart trees, right? The children of the forest do worship the old gods as well. That's something that they share with the northerners. And for a long time, a lot of the children of the forest lived in peace and harmony with the first men when they initially landed, although they did have a conflict initially when they first landed because the children of the forest didn't like how they were essentially like cutting down the forest and the trees to build their houses and keeps and eventually castles, right? But they couldn't get that far because the children of the forest would constantly interfere. And they had that's when their magic was strongest, right? And they were a big threat and very tough to deal with. But the men did have armor and swords, and they were able to hold their own. But eventually, they did come to kind of like a ceasefire, right? And Catelyn also takes note of how the heart trees, the ones with the faces, right? They only exist in the north, although, and I quote, in the south, the last weirwoods had been cut down or burned over 1,000 years ago. Here, in the north, every castle had its godswood, and every godswood had its heart tree, and every heart tree its face. So once again, just a reminder that in the north, all throughout it, doesn't matter where, not just Winterfell, but all the other castles and keeps, right? They worship the old gods. They pray to the heart trees. They pray to these trees with faces. That's what they are meant to be. That is their priest. That is their church. That is their chapel. That is their god, in a manner of speaking. That's why it's the ones with the faces, right? Now, after all this history and world building, we finally have Catelyn interacting with her husband, Eddard Stark, aka Ned. She approaches Ned as he sits in front of the heart tree, cleaning his sword. Ice. He names. She calls his name, catching him off guard. And this is just a little subtle reminder that he's not used to seeing her here. So he instinctively thinks something's wrong and immediately asks, "Where are the children?" To which she responds, "In the kitchen, arguing on names for the direwolf pups." So this is how we know it's official. All of the Stark children have received their pet direwolf, which is how the last chapter ended. Just a reminder, chapter 1, that was the previous chapter. We are well, chapter 1, Bran, right? This is now chapter 2, but it is the first chapter of Catelyn's story. So, and I quote, Arya is already in love, and Sansa is charmed and gracious, but Rickon is not quite sure. So this is the remainder, or the last of the Stark children that weren't in the first chapter, as we get our confirmation that they also get their wolves, right? This is the first mention of them. Maybe they got mentioned once or twice in the previous chapter, but this is just kind of like I said, them getting their puppies, their wolf pups. Um, as we know, Robb, Bran, and Jon, they were all there in the first chapter, as well as their father, as they both found the puppies and argued for their right to keep them at the end of the previous chapter, aka chapter 1. Catelyn confesses that Rickon, as I said in that quote, is scared of the puppy since he is only 3. To which Ned responds with a frown. And I quote, "He must learn to face his fears. He will not be 3 forever, and winter is coming." This is the first mention of the Stark house words. Winter is coming. Catelyn expands the mythos between the different sayings of the different noble houses. Yes, Catelyn agrees. The words gave her a chill, as they always did. The Stark words. Every noble house had its words. Family mottos, touchstones, prayers of sorts. They boasted of honor and glory, promised loyalty and truth, swore faith and courage. All but the Starks. Winter is coming, said the Stark words.